So thank you, Fiona, for the very kind introduction. I'd just like to say what a pleasure it is to be here today speaking to such a big audience and the first talk, so there's no pressure. And I hope today will be just a really, really engaging series of research talks. And so as Fiona says, I'm going to talk a little bit about my PhD research project that I only just finished last month, actually. And it relates to how we may one day be able to feed the world with crop waste and bugs. So I'd like to start by looking into the future. So by the year 2050, the world is expected to have a protein deficit of up to 50%. And now this equates to around 100 million tonnes of protein, where demand will actually outstrip supply. And so essentially what this means is that the world will only be able to produce half the amount of protein to sustain the population on it. And that is in just 27 years. So these problems are not problems for the next generation, they're problems for our generation. So if we look into the factors involved in how we might get to that state in 2050, or hopefully not get there, we live in a world where the population is growing rapidly. And so that population stands at around about 8 billion people currently today. And by 2050, that population is expected to rise to around about 10 billion. And so an additional 2 billion people will require sources of high quality food, and in particular sources of high quality protein for healthy growth and development. So if you think about what we as humans eat at the moment in terms of protein sources, it's mainly still meat, fish and dairy products like eggs. And even though in the Western world there's a lot of trends towards vegetarianism and veganism, actually on a global level, meat and fish consumption is rising considerably. And of course what that's doing is it's posing increased demand on the protein sources which we feed to livestock. So we currently feed animals, which we process into meat and fish products, a lot of protein sources like soybean meal, for example, or fish meal you may have heard of as well. And these are very, very good protein sources, although they're not sustainable to meet today's protein demand, and they're certainly not sustainable to meet tomorrow's either. And the reason for this is you may have heard about deforestation associated with soybean meal production, and effectively what we're having to do is change land use to eliminate forests within South America, particularly in Brazil, for example, in order to plant soybean to produce soybean meal. And this is not sustainable. So we need to find alternative protein sources that are as performative as what we currently use, like soybean, but crucially that are more sustainable. And I really believe that black soldier fly could be the solution to this. So on the left here you have the black soldier fly, and that's the adult fly. And what's really interesting about this is that the adult only survives for around about 5 to 8 days, and it doesn't have a mouth. And the reason why it doesn't have a mouth is because it feeds on the reserves developed during the larval stages, and it's the black soldier fly larvae that I'm really interested in was really interested in during my PhD research. So black soldier fly larvae have what we call a saprophytic ability, and that's an ability to feed on decaying organic matter in nature. So you can think of decaying organic matter as organic waste and residues which we may produce as humans. So these insects could potentially be used and to clear up waste that we as humans generate and convert them into a really valuable protein source which we can feed to livestock or potentially to humans if we can try and overcome some of these public perception problems of insect protein. They're also very nutritious, so they convert their feed into a very high protein body and an amino acid profile that's actually more favourable to fish and chickens and pigs, for example. Their production is also very, very environmentally efficient, and these insects can be farmed vertically. Instead of using horizontal pieces of land like we currently do for arable land, we can farm insects in a vertical manner, so we use space a lot more efficiently. They also need a lot less water for their production, and crucially, they emit less greenhouse gas, which contributes less to climate change. So that's brilliant, but of course, these black soldier fly larvae are actually sold on the market today and are produced by a variety of different companies. So all of the black soldier fly larvae producers, like Enterra, for example, in Canada, and Enviroflight in the US, Innovafeed in France and Protix in the Netherlands, all of these companies produce black soldier fly larvae, but the problem is they're just too expensive. And we're trying to compete with large commodity scale soybean meal and fish meal production, and to do that, we need to bring the cost of black soldier fly larvae production down. So all of these companies use food waste to feed their larvae. And on the face of it, this seemed like a great idea. You know, we generate a lot of food waste as mankind do. And the problem with this is that the proportion of food waste that we can feed to larvae under current regulations is actually a very small proportion of that totally produced globally. And that's due to various food safety reasons, so that we can only feed black soldier fly larvae with pre-consumer food waste. So this is food waste that hasn't come into contact with humans and therefore comes out of, say, fruit and vegetable processing, or the beer brewing industry releases brewer spent grain. And so it's these kinds of residues that we can feed to black soldier fly larvae, but they only represent about 10 to 20% of the total food waste produced. So this causes a problem of scale, in that the livestock feed industries want to transition over to using black soldier fly larvae instead of soybean meal, but can't because the scales aren't there yet. And so there's a growing market need, therefore, for alternative feeds that have the scalability required. And so agricultural crop residues are a potentially really interesting and potentially excellent candidate to feed to black soldier fly larvae. So what are these crop residues? Well, you can think of various crops that are produced in the UK, like wheat, for example, oilseed rape, and you can also think of rice, for example, which is particularly produced in Southeast Asia. And all of these crops have an associated byproduct, which typically is a straw product. Now, this straw product, lots of them have very little to no commercial utility. And that's largely down to the fact that they're composed of what we call lignocellulose. And lignocellulose is pictured here on the slide, and it's a very complex matrix of 3 different types of polymer. So we have 2 sugar-rich polymers within lignocellulose, cellulose and hemicellulose. And we also have a really interesting but very difficult molecule to work with called lignin. And effectively, these 3 different components interact together to form a complex matrix known as lignocellulose, and that is very difficult to break down either mechanically or, with interest with my PhD research, enzymatically. So lignocellulose has actually evolved to protect the plant from pathogenic attack, and it's evolved to help the plant deal with harsh weather conditions. But some microorganisms in nature have actually evolved the ability to degrade lignocellulose. And so these organisms secrete different enzymes which target the different components of lignocellulose to break them down. The reason why they're doing this is because they want to live just like we do, and they want to feed on the sugars composed within the cellulose of this complex cell wall matrix. And so it's this ability that we leveraged during my PhD project. And so I did my PhD in Professor Neil Bruce's group within CNAP at the university, and also in collaboration with Ferroscience Limited, and it was a BBSRC funded project. So we exploited the ability of a really exciting fungus which secretes a range of different enzymes to break down lignocellulose in nature. So we isolated this microorganism, we grew it on wheat straw, and we could see that we can convert wheat straw into an edible feed for black soldier fly larvae. And I should also say that where you feed black soldier fly larvae with wheat straw not treated with this fungus, they actually all die, and which is a real shame to see, actually. And unfortunately, there's no ethics behind the use of insects in research, but we do, of course, try and reduce the number that we use. And so that's the approach that my PhD took. But of course, you can consider this pre-treatment process in a much wider circular economy approach. So at the moment, lots of wheat straw, oilseed rape straw, but also oil palm waste in Southeast Asia, for example, is generated, and as I say, has very little use at the moment. But you can imagine that if we could treat these residues with the fungus to enable them to be a feed for black soldier fly larvae, we could generate an alternative protein source, which we could then feed to fish, as pictured here, in aquaculture setups, for example. And the waste generated in the rearing process of the insects is known as frass, and that waste can be used as well. And essentially what frass is it's residual feed, and it's also insect excrement, but it can be put back onto the land from which the waste came, so we can close that nutrient loop, and we can also create a circular economy approach. And at the moment, we live in a linear economy where we use a product and then dispose of it, and of course, this is making use of all the waste generated throughout the process. So given the fact that this technology has real translational potential, I was really interested in actually understanding how can we take technologies out of universities and get them into the real world to produce real world impact. And so during the first COVID lockdown, a postdoc and I, Neil's group, Dr. Daniel Leadbeater and I, applied for the Global Bio-Based Business Plan competition. And essentially what that does is it gets PhD students and postdocs to think about their science in a more commercial sense. And so we developed a licensing business model around the technology that I'd been working on in the lab, And we actually went on to win the UK semi-final and the international final against finalists from Germany and Finland. So this was about a year and a half ago, and it was really exciting to see the sector be genuinely interested in the technology we're developing in the lab. So this meant that Dan and I could speak to those companies that I've mentioned before and really understand their problem from an industrial side. So there's no point sort of generating and creating technological solutions to problems that in industry that don't exist. So it's really important to talk to the end user of any technologies coming out of university research to make sure that it solves the problem that they have. And Yorkshire is a brilliant region to do this kind of translational science. And I admit I'm a Yorkshireman, so I'm slightly biased, but it really is a brilliant place to do research like this. And that's a lot to do with the Bio-Yorkshire Initiative, which you may hear about more today. So the Bio-Yorkshire Initiative is a partnership between the University of York, Ferroscience Limited, and Ask and Bryan College. And both of these companies are just north of York. Now, University of York brings its world-class research excellence to the fore, which you'll hear about today. And Ferroscience Limited is a translational research science centre which increasingly is working to take technologies out of its science and into the real world to generate products and services for the company, but also for public good too. Ask and Bryan College is an agricultural college, and they bring really interesting insight from landowners and to do with environmental land management and give a farmer's perspective, which is really important when working in agricultural science. And these different organisations are leveraged by expertise in the Biorenewables Development Centre, which is an open access R&D centre that works between academia and industry to scale up the processes coming out of universities. So universities might operate at a lab scale, for example, and the Biorenewables Development Centre would help scale those technologies to perhaps hundreds of kilograms or hundreds of litres of a product, for example. BioVale is a networking organisation that helps to network a variety of different stakeholders in the bioeconomy within Yorkshire, but also the UK and globally. So all of these organisations can work together to develop bio-based supplies of fuels, chemicals and materials that we really need. And this, of course, fits with the government's Levelling Up agenda, in which science, research and innovation lies at the heart if we are to meet those really important net zero carbon targets by 2050. And so back in March last year, we're really fortunate to have the Science Minister, George Freeman MP, come and visit the University of York and Bio-Yorkshire partners. And I got the chance to speak to him about the research they've been doing during the PhD and some of the translational efforts that were going on to commercialise the research. And it was really great to see that he shared the same vision, in that we need to be translating science not only for public good, but also into commercial offerings, because at the end of the day, these are the offerings that are going to help change the world and tackle climate change. So we need to begin to work in a slightly different way, and George Freeman could see that as well. So one thing that George was really keen on is that this research solves global challenges, and that's what the session of this session is aiming to focus on. So if we look at agricultural crop waste management, this is a global issue. Many countries produce a range of different residues, Southeast Asia, South America, all over the world. And of course, the protein problem is also a global problem. So by combining these two global problems and developing the pre-treatment process to enable the black soldier fly larvae growth sector to grow, it may be that technologies can be harnessed and developed in the Bio-Yorkshire framework so that then we can roll these technologies out commercially and globally. And hopefully, my vision is that one day we really will feed the world with crop waste and bugs. So thank you very much. And I'd just like to say thank you to all the people on the slide. It's been a real pleasure to be here today, and thanks to Fiona as well. Thank you.